Today we're looking at immigration, which is a particularly complex moral issue, and one that's a good example for seeing how a Christian ethics might approach complex moral problems. We read The Morality of Migration by Celia Banahib, and she sees the complexity of the immigration issue as a result of the interaction or conflicts between four different basic moral issues. There's the universal right to hospitality, the right of all persons to freely share the earth. There's the right to free movement, which is the right of a person to leave their country and go to another country. There's the right to self determination of any nation to determine its own citizens, its own policies, and its own culture, the basic right to democratic self determination. And she also thinks that there are things called associative rights that come from longstanding economic and cultural interactions between different groups that affect the rights of immigrants who are part of those groups that have had longstanding relationships with the nations to which they immigrate. And it's further complicated by the fact that undocumented immigrants um, have children who are in no way responsible for the entry into that country. And that also raises questions about whether people who haven't done anything to cause or to choose their circumstances or status are responsible for that status. So let's go through them one at a time. Kant, in his great work, Perpetual Peace, in which he tried to express what he meant in that fourth formulation of the categorical imperative to act so as to create a world of ends, um, and which became the foundation for most theories of international government, like the United Nations. He recognized a right of hospitality because all persons have an equal right to inhabit the earth, which wasn't given to any particular person by any god or force. He thinks that a stranger has a right not to be treated as an enemy when he arrives in the land of another. They have to be on their best behavior, but Kant thinks that everyone has a right to be received in any place that they come to. Um, So you can see that Kant might use the third formulation being treated as an end and not a means. It might be inconvenient in some ways to welcome someone into another country, but you should always treat them as an end and not really as a means. And you can sort of see how you might get an imperfect duty from the first formulation by suggesting that if you formulate your maxim in the right way, that uh, in order to convenience myself, uh, I will never allow any stranger into our community. Um, you can see that if that were made universal, it might turn out to inconvenience you as well, and might violate the consistency of ends test for the categorical imperative. There's also a right to free movement that's been part of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. It said everyone has a right to freedom of movement and residence, and everyone has the right to leave their country and then to return to their country. A related right is a right to seek asylum from persecution. Some immigrants, as we'll see, are either refugees from terrible conditions, uh, disasters, or wars in their own nation, and some are seeking asylum from types of persecution, violence, and danger in their own nation. And the Declaration of Human Rights recognizes a right of asylum as well. and the right of asylum has been part of common law in almost all nations since the Middle Ages. You can watch this video that explains a little bit of the difference between an immigrant or refugee and someone who's seeking asylum, an asylee. So in the United States, there were a number of programs that were put in place to actually deter undocumented immigration and asylum seekers. Such punitive measures as incarcerating or detaining people who sought asylum, who entered the country without documentation, and then separating them from their children and holding them in conditions like the cages that you see in this image. So just as before, besides asking whether something is moral or not, whether it's moral or not to seek asylum or to enter a country, we should also ask what types of punishments, what types of reactions to those actions are moral on the part of our government. There's also a right to self-determination. The most basic one involved here is that we believe that people have a right to determine their own laws, their own culture, and their own social and economic uh, situation. So we can pass laws that limit immigration, that limit entitlements, and that limit the ability to vote to people who are designated as U.S. citizens. In the United States, I think we're all aware that the right to self-determination isn't absolute. We have a Bill of Rights, and we believe that no government, even if it's made into a law by a majority of vote, by a vote of the majority, can limit basic human rights. So the Bill of Rights enumerates those things that Congress can make no law. Um, so the right to self-determination isn't absolute, but you can sort of see the moral problem. If you started um, a club to say discuss philosophy, and you let anybody in, um, you might find your philosophy discussion club overwhelmed by people who want to talk about soccer, or people who want to fight, or people who want to watch football, or all kinds of different things. So you might think that a group has in some way a right to determine when other people may join the group. So the right to self-determination, you can see, is in some way in conflict with our right to free travel, which you could see is one of the basic human capabilities that someone like Nussbaum would list and argue for as part of a universal Bill of Rights. And lastly, the reading talks about associative rights, and this applies mainly to the types of migrant workers that habitually worked in the farmlands of California. But there are long-standing practices in the United States and many countries where undocumented workers do work at lower wages and under conditions that other citizens would not be willing to do. And these long-standing arrangements produce certain types of rights, according to the author. So since we've been using their labor to give us cheap food, we have some obligation to treat them and allow them to gain citizenship, according to this argument. Oh, and of course, this a more difficult case is going to be the problem of the children of immigrants, and this involves a moral principle that the author states is that a child should not be punished, or a person should be punished for circumstances that they did not choose and can't control. Um, so the question is, what should we do with the children of undocumented immigrants, either ones that they bring with them or ones that they have while they're in the United States? Now, the policy is that any child born within the United States automatically becomes a citizen. And there was a legislation that's gained much interest and controversy called the Dreamer Act, or DACA, which aimed at providing a road to citizenship for children who were brought here by undocumented families. The video that follows explains a little bit of the moral and legal issues involved in that piece of administrative action called DACA. So the utilitarian argument with regards to immigration would settle up on the economic effects of immigration. Despite popular arguments about immigrants taking American jobs, almost everyone agrees, both conservative and liberal groups both agree that immigration has a great economic effect or produces great economic benefits for the economy of the United States. Here you can see estimates of the contribution to the gross national product of various different changes in undocumented immigrant status. And this great advances that are made to our economic situation by immigrants is mostly due to the fact that immigrants are usually people who come of working age. They almost always work for a living. They don't typically burden systems of entitlements like Medicare or Social Security, and they pay taxes so that they're a net benefit to the U.S. Treasury. And in nations that are especially aging, you can see that immigrants or foreign-born persons produce a large portion, significant portion of the workforce, both in menial jobs and in highly qualified PhD and scientific engineering jobs. So utilitarian would point to the great benefits of allowing immigration as an argument for allowing it. Now, all of these arguments have been the types of moral arguments we've looked at during the theories we've looked at so far. Christianity, of course, is saying that none of that matters. Instead, you have an obligation to love your neighbor as yourself. You have an obligation to welcome the stranger as you would welcome Christ himself. And that's of course, the version of that obligation to hospitality that you find within the Rule of Benedict that you read in Conversatio. So, Father James Martin, in the reading that you had and in the video that follows these slides, talks about how all contemporary Christian leaders have recognized this important Christian obligation to welcome the stranger. St. John Paul II, the recent Pope, said the illegal immigrant or illegal migrant comes before us like that stranger whom Jesus asked to be recognized. To welcome him and to show him solidarity is a duty of hospitality and fidelity to Christian identity itself. And he says that it's necessary to guard against the rise of new forms of racism or xenophobic behavior, which attempt to make these brothers and sisters of ours scapegoats for what may be difficult local situations. And Pope Francis, the current Pope, says someone who thinks only of building walls, of keeping immigrants out, and not of building bridges is not Christian. This is not the gospel. So on this particular issue, Christianity is very clear about what your moral obligations are. Of course, the passage that we talked about in the last class was the version of the Good Samaritan from Matthew that says, when you were a stranger, you did not take care of me. I say that if you do not do it to the least of these, you do not do it to me. So especially asylum seekers and refugees are precisely the least of these, the suffering in whom Christianity believes you'll most clearly see the face of Christ, and that insofar as you fail to welcome these persons, you're failing to recognize Christ himself. So this is a claim that the welcoming the stranger and the needy violates both of the main commandments of Christianity. Not only to love your neighbor as yourself, you are commanded to love um, even those persons who might be inconvenient, even those people you may not like, even those people who are your enemies, and especially those who have need for their material conditions. Um, but you're also commanded to love God with your whole heart and your whole soul. And in this case, loving God isn't an abstract matter of worship or devotion. It's the concrete act of seeing God in the face of the stranger and the exile. So we're going to be spending some time thinking, what could this mean? Because obviously, um, we might say, but we can't accept all of these people, or we can't. It would be inconvenient to allow 15 people to come and sleep in my house, or to take the homeless person that I see in the street in and take care of them. Um, in this respect, Christianity is sort of a very difficult and unflinching and uncompromising ethical view. Remember, Jesus said, "Sell all you own and give it to the poor, and come and follow me." It's harder for a rich man to enter into heaven than for a camel to pass through the eye of a needle. So we're going to have to ask, what could it mean to live a life according to a set of standards which seem to be impossible for us to live up to? Could you really treat every single needy person as if they were the face of Christ itself? Could we really welcome all of the strangers, all of the needy, all of the refugees fleeing from the various different natural disasters, famines, and war zones on our planet? Wouldn't that overwhelm us just as if we took everyone who needed to come in into our house or into our family? So we're going to have to ask if we are going to take these Christian admonitions seriously, or this Christian ethic seriously. How are we supposed to act when it seems to ask of us things that are impossible for us to do? And those are the questions we'll start asking next time when we look at various different philosophical ways, philosophical theories that have attempted to get clear about what exactly is involved in the Christian admonition to love your neighbor as yourself.
We hear these terms all the time: migrant, refugee, asylum seeker, immigrant. What's the difference? Let's break it down. A migrant is a person moving from country to country for any number of reasons: better life, better job, more opportunities. An immigrant is someone who moved to another country and has established residency legally or illegally. Then there are refugees and asylum seekers. They both seek protection because they fear persecution based on a number of factors, including race, religion, membership in a particular social group, or political opinion. But the process of how they get protection differs. Refugees must apply from overseas and have to be vetted and approved before traveling to the United States. Asylum seekers are people who are already in the U.S. or at the border. They must apply for protection within 1 year of arriving. Whether you are a migrant, refugee, immigrant, or asylum seeker, it can take years to get legal status in the United States.
I remember the day that I found out I was undocumented, I got a call from an admissions office from a university that I had applied to. They wanted to see a green card. I was extremely embarrassed. My mother just started crying. In between her tears, she just started apologizing and told me that it was her fault and that she wanted a better future for us, and look at what happened.
That's Juan Escalante. When he was 11 years old, Juan and his family came to the United States from Venezuela, where life had become dangerous.
We were driving, and we stopped at a red light, and a man approaches the car, and he tells my mother if she doesn't surrender the car to him, he is going to pull out a gun and kill one of her kids in the car right there. We picked up everything, we sold all our toys, and just embarked on this journey.
Juan made it to college and graduated, but because he was undocumented, he couldn't work, and he worried about being deported.
Even like a trip to the grocery store, and you get pulled over, and that's it, it's game over.
But that changed in June of 2012.
Effective immediately, the Department of Homeland Security is taking steps to lift the shadow of deportation from these young people.
If you'd come to the U.S. when you were under 16, if you were either in high school or had a high school diploma, and if you had either no criminal record or like a teeny tiny misdemeanor,
then you could apply for the Deferred Action for Childhood Arrivals, or DACA program. Basically, a permit that protects you from getting deported and allows you to work legally in the U.S. Juan got this protection, and so did nearly 800,000 others who applied. But now, that protection is gone.
I'm here today to announce that the program known as DACA that was effectuated under the Obama administration is being rescinded.
DACA was designed to protect a generation of young undocumented immigrants known as Dreamers, named after a bill called the DREAM Act, which had been floating around Congress for more than a decade, and with bipartisan support. The bill would have given unauthorized immigrants who grew up in the U.S. a way to gain legal status and eventually apply for citizenship. And even though it fell short of 60 Senate votes in 2010, the idea was still popular with the American public.
when President Obama announced DACA, it was in the middle of the 2012 presidential campaign, but it didn't turn into a huge campaign issue because Republicans were really ambivalent about turning immigration into a wedge issue.
We need to help accommodate these kids who, through no fault of their own, find themselves in this legal limbo.
We cannot forever have children who were brought here by their parents when they were small children to live in the shadows.
But in 2014, Obama proposed making older immigrants eligible for DACA and creating similar protections against deportation for undocumented parents with children who were U.S. citizens.
And a lot of Republicans said, whoa, that's too far.
These new actions would have protected about 4.5 million people, nearly half the estimated undocumented population. A group of 26 states sued the Obama administration over the expansion, and they won. A federal judge stopped the DACA expansions from going into effect, hinting that they were probably unconstitutional.
People had started thinking back to, well, if those bigger programs were unconstitutional, what does that say about this DACA program that's already in place?
Then came Donald Trump.
When Mexico sends its people, they're not sending their best. They're bringing drugs, they're bringing crime, they're rapists.
Once Donald Trump became the leading Republican presidential candidate running on an immigration hardline platform, Republicans started to look at things in a new light.
If it weren't for me, you wouldn't even be talking about illegal immigration.
When Trump won, DACA's fate seemed sealed. But even though he revoked lots of Obama's other executive orders on immigration, nearly 8 months into his term, he still hadn't ended DACA.
A lot of the immigration hawks began to go, wait, we were promised that you were going to get rid of this amnesty that exists right now. What the heck happened?
So a bunch of states threatened to sue the government over DACA again if Trump didn't get rid of it, which brings us to early September 2017.
It is my duty to ensure that the laws of the United States are enforced and that the constitutional order is upheld.
It's a very stark message that leaves a whole lot of people who've only considered themselves to be Americans in limbo for the next several months.
In the 5 years it's been around, DACA has had a big impact on young undocumented immigrants. A survey of DACA recipients found nearly 70% got a job with better pay. More than 60% opened their first bank account. Nearly 65% bought their first car, and a similar share say that they've pursued educational opportunities they previously couldn't. But when these protections expire over the coming weeks, months, or years, they'll be back where they started before 2012, unable to work legally and constantly at risk for deportation.
The question of how to treat migrants and refugees is making headlines these days. It's a contemporary question. It's also an old question which is addressed many times in the Jewish and Christian traditions. So it's worth asking, what does the Bible say about how we're supposed to treat refugees, migrants, and foreigners? Well, it's pretty clear, and it starts all the way back in the book of Exodus. God tells Moses, and through him the whole people of Israel, "You shall not oppress the resident alien among you. You know the heart of an alien, for you were aliens in the land of Egypt." That's two messages from God. First, care for the refugee. In the ancient Near East, as outsiders, people without an attachment to a clan, foreigners were vulnerable and often poor, just like migrants and refugees today. So they needed special help. Second, God is reminding the Israelites that they were themselves aliens once, when they were in exile in Egypt. The Old Testament reminds us of this in Exodus, Leviticus, and Deuteronomy. In fact, the book of Deuteronomy says that God loves the stranger. Psalm 146 echoes this, saying, "The Lord protects the stranger." The Hebrew Scriptures remind us of two essential things. First, God's command to care for refugees, migrants, and aliens. Second, God's special love for them. In case we missed the point, in the book of Kings, King Solomon directs his people to pay attention to the foreigner who does not belong to your people Israel, but has come from a distant land. And what are we to do? Solomon says, "Do according to all that the foreigner calls you to." In other words, answer any need that the migrant or refugee has. Jesus is even stronger about this in the New Testament. In the parable of the Good Samaritan from the Gospel of Luke, Jesus tells the story of a Jewish man going from Jerusalem to Jericho and who is robbed and beaten. As he's lying by the side of the road, two people pass by, a priest and a Levite, both from the man's own religious group. They were probably afraid to stop. The road to Jericho, which still exists, was notoriously dangerous and prone to robbers. Finally, a Samaritan man stops to help. Samaritans were the traditional opponents of the Jews, outsiders. Notice that the Samaritan doesn't care about the danger, or maybe he does and helps the man anyway. Jesus reminds us that we're called to help the stranger even if there's risk involved. Jesus doesn't say help the stranger only if it's risk-free, or only if it's convenient, or only if that person is from the same religious group as you. No, Jesus says show mercy to the stranger regardless. He's also saying that just like the beaten man, our own salvation may depend upon a stranger. In fact, Jesus says that the way we treat strangers will be a litmus test for entrance into heaven. At the Last Judgment, he'll say to some people, "I was a stranger and you didn't welcome me." And some people will answer, "Lord, when did we see you as a stranger and not help you?" And he will say that every time you didn't help a stranger, you didn't help me. That's the way it will be decided who enters heaven, says Jesus. And just in case you think that this only applies to individuals, the traditional name for this passage in the New Testament might help. It's called the Judgment of the Nations. Perhaps the strongest message from Jesus is not what he said, but what he did. After his birth, Mary and Joseph take Jesus from Israel to Egypt. Were there border guards and passports during what's called the flight into Egypt? No. But Mary and Joseph and their son were fleeing persecution and the threat of death at the hands of King Herod. So using the contemporary definition, we can say that among all the refugees that our world has seen were Mary, Joseph, and Jesus.